So I'm going to begin with a question to throw at you. You can't really answer this question. Well, you can in the Q&A if you like, but you can answer it in your head. So the question is, from which century of classical antiquity does the most epic poetry survive? Now, the answer may be a surprise. The answer is the 5th century AD. Here at the very end of classical antiquity, a series of brilliant poets wrote the last hexameter poems in existence, pretty much until the antiquarian revivals of the Renaissance, in Greek at any rate. Now, whether the 5th century AD is still part of classical antiquity is, of course, a legitimate question. By this stage, the city of Rome had fallen to the Visigoths, and a new Rome had been built in the Greek-speaking east of the empire, Constantinople, the great city on the Bosporus, known today as Istanbul. Though it was vastly enhanced as a new imperial capital, Constantinople wasn't a new foundation. It was, in fact, built on an older foundation, Byzantium. So the era that we're dealing with is ipso facto the Byzantine one. Now, you might be tempted to say that the 5th century AD is not a period of classical antiquity, that we're in a different period here, that we're on the threshold of the Middle Ages. But historical periods and the breaks between them are, to an extent, arbitrary. A different question is, did the inhabitants of the New Rome, as they called it, think of themselves as belonging to the same world as the Old Rome? And here matters become more intricate. The New Rome was a paradox. On the one hand, it was the continuation of the ancient city and indeed its perfection and fulfillment. We get a lot of rhetoric along those lines. But on the other hand, it was cut off from the prior world, not only by geography and chronology, but also for its inhabitants, and more importantly, by ideology and religion. Constantinople was, in its very inception, a Christian city named for Rome's first Christian emperor. Now, the 5th and 6th centuries were a time of transition, what Reinhard Koselleck famously called a Sattelzeit, or a saddle period, bridging period. Now, some scholars have objected to Koselleck's idea of the bridging period, this Sattelzeit, on the grounds that transitions happen all the time in human history, and you don't normally know that you're living through one. But no one in Constantinople in the 5th and 6th centuries can have been unaware of the explicit project to combine old and new. On the one hand, there was a deliberate attempt to embed the new religious dispensation by turning pagan sites into Christian ones, by defiling and deconsecrating pagan religious imagery. On the other hand, the new Rome saw itself as a capital of culture, and culture inevitably meant the embrace of models of rhetoric, philosophy, and poetry rooted in the deep past. Constantinople sought to reposition and circumscribe the old pagan culture via an artful blend of forgetting, remembering, and reimagining. And this, of course, is a major part of the reason why epic was still being written and read in Constantinople. Poets were as aware as anyone that their world sat between the new and the old. Let me take as an example one Agathias Scholasticus, who was in fact instrumental in creating the corpus of short epigrams that we now call the Greek anthology. Agathias was a writer of epigrams himself, but he was also a collector and editor of epigrams, and he collected poems by his peers into what he called a cycle. We know it now as the cycle of Agathias. And this cycle of Agathias, together with the Garland of Philip, compiled in the 1st century AD, and the Garland of Meleager in the 1st century BC, formed the basis of the Palatine anthology, the vast manuscript that now sits in the Library of Heidelberg. Agathias wrote 2 prefaces explaining what he was doing with his collection of poems. And it's the first one that I want to focus on, in particular, one very short passage from within it, where he talks about the first tranche of poems in his collection, which are poems that are composed in imitation of ancient paganism. And it's really interesting, this idea that he sees himself not as a continuous, organic, if you like, an organic continuator of this prior tradition, but as an imitator, someone who comes from outside and someone who mimics the style of ancient paganism. So here is Agathias Scholasticus in translation. First of all, he says, competing with past generations, I would select for you all that the begetters of new song wrote as if in devotion to the gods of yore, for it seemed fitting to preserve also the clever imitation of ancient writing. Now, that's my slightly clunky translation, but the idea of that translation is to bring out all of the beats, if you like, in Agathias's self-presentation. Now, on the one hand, he thinks of himself and the poets he collects as, in his phrase, begetters of new song. And on the other hand, he imagines himself to be competing with past generations. So there's a inbuilt relationship between new and old, which is defined through competition. He's competing with past generations. He also intriguingly thinks of himself as preserving the clever imitation of ancient writing. So the new poets are, of course, not writing in honor of the gods of yore, but they can mimic that ancient devotion. And it's that language of mimicry that is very interesting because it implies an artifice, a constructedness to this act of representation of paganism. What Agathias tries to do is produce a kind of simulacrum, similar in form and language, but without the theological commitment to paganism. So the late antique attitude to pagan literature was interestingly conflicted between adoration of pagan classics and condemnation. For an example of condemnation, let me turn to the Pseudo-Clementine Recognitions. What a snappy title that is. It's a 3rd century novel-like fiction that tells of the conversion of Clement, an early bishop of Rome, to Christianity and his various shenanigans with the Apostle Paul. Now, the original Greek text is lost. What survives is a 4th century Latin translation. The final book of the Pseudo-Clementine Recognitions, Book 10, carries Clement's feisty invectives against the immorality of the pagan gods, focusing in particular on Zeus's sexual behavior, covering incest, adultery, and sexual violence. And in particular, his transformation into various humiliating forms, showers of gold, bulls, and the like, in order to achieve his aims. Now, what interests me about this passage is that the author of this text specifically blames the poets for promoting these ideas. Ought not they, that's the poets, he says, if they have debased the honourable and pious deeds of the gods with base fables, be forthwith cast away and thrown into the fire, that they may not persuade the still tender age of boys that Jupiter himself, the chief of the gods, was a parricide towards his parents, incestuous towards his sisters and his daughters, and even impure towards boys, that Venus and Mars were adulterers, and that all those things which have been spoken of above. Now, such criticisms of the immorality of pagan epic were not, of course, per se new to Christianity, but what was new was the idea that they pointed to the non-existence or sublunary demonic existence of pagan gods, rather than their misrepresentation through poetic license. So on the one hand, we do have, and I could give you many other examples, we do have a really strong Christian tradition of attacking pagan epic as a vehicle for all kinds of immorality, but in particular, sexual and theological immorality. But this wasn't the only approach possible. A crucial moment occurs in the late 4th century. And remember, this is post-Constantine, so after the conversion of, or at least the, if you like, the tipping point where the empire is Christianizing rapidly. We have 2 really eminent theologians who are amongst the most influential of Christians in late antiquity generally. And these are Basil of Caesarea and his friend Gregory of Nazianzus, who, along with Gregory of Nyssa, who was Basil's brother, constitute the so-called Cappadocian Fathers. So as I say, they're the most influential theologians of their day and arguably of late antiquity as a whole. Now, times were fraught in the late 4th century. These people were Trinitarians in a world that was still full of Arians. So on the one hand, there was a theological battle to be fought, but I'm not so interested in that. I'm more interested in their position as individuals who are attempting to instill a kind of Christian intellectualism in the aftermath of the reign of the Emperor Julian. Now, Julian had attempted, as we all know, to restore a modified form of paganism in the mid 4th century. And in particular, Julian, we are told, had introduced a school law supposedly banning Christians from teaching works of pagan literature. Of course, like most things in antiquity, it's contested precisely what he did ban. But whatever the truth of Julian's intent and practice, it's undeniable that post-Julianic Christians took Julian's supposedly anti-Christian legislation as a prompt for outraged condemnation of Julian. And crucially for us, this was the spur for Christian intellectuals to reclaim a Christianized version of the classical canon. So on the one hand, we have people saying pagan epic is rotten to the core, but then by the late 4th century, these two superstar intellectuals, Gregory and Basil in particular, are coming along and saying, no, Christianity is perfectly compatible with the classical canon. Julian was wrong in this. Julian was wrong to drive a wedge between the two. What we're going to do is bring them together. Gregory wrote a large number of poems late in life that combined Christian message with pagan form. Basil, meanwhile, wrote a tract on how Christian readers should read pagan literature. They should, in Basil's view, behave like bees, culling the nutritious pollen from pre-Christian tradition and discarding the rest. So it's a really fascinating image. Now, Basil is seemingly modeling his tract on a similar dialogue, a similar discussion by Plutarch, written in the 2nd century CE, but it's crucially different because whereas Plutarch puts the premium on trying to understand the intention of the ancient author, Basil has no interest whatsoever in the intention of the author. He's only interested in what we might call cultural appropriation of the most thoroughgoing type. The only value of pagan literature is when it can be shown to be useful to Christian purpose. You can discard the rest, just as the bees discard parts of the flower that don't provide pollen. So the Christian reader is encouraged to see pagan literature as a repository of more or less useful sentiments, which the Christian can adopt or discard at will. So we have two approaches to the pagan heritage: wholesale rejection and selective embrace. Now, these put very heavy pressure on the idea of a tradition. In the New Rome, everybody is trying to work out what the relationship between the New Rome and the Old Rome is. And to what extent Gregory and Basil thought of themselves as sharing a tradition with the ancients is not altogether clear. Basil distinguishes systematically between we Christians, the first person plural is insistent, and the ancients in the third person plural. And he urges his readers to use all caution, passer phulaker in Greek, when encountering pagan texts. Literature is for Basil not a tradition in the sense of a valued patrimony to which one is entitled by virtue of a shared line of inheritance. It's a resource to be exploited. It's inert matter that will yield benefit only if it's actively and consciously refashioned by the dominant Christian culture. In the Greek-speaking world, epic always highlights the trade-off between tradition and adaptation, right from the very start, if you like. The Odyssey is already thinking of the Iliad as a prior tradition, which it is reacting to both through continuity and through change. But late antique Christians no longer felt the corpus of pagan epic to have an automatic place in the cultural cosmos of the present. Any case for its continued role needed ongoing reaffirmation. So how did people go about Christianizing pagan poetry? Now, this could be done by any number of means. One prominent example was what we call the cento. The cento is a really interesting genre which we find simultaneously emerging in Latin and Greek, and interestingly, with female authors in both cases, in the Latin side and the Greek side. What is a cento? A cento is when a poet takes lines and phrases from a classic poem and refashions them to tell a new story. Now, we know that pagans, in inverted commas, earlier in the empire were doing this sort of thing. We have one or two examples. There's one preserved of a poem that takes various Homeric lines and uses them to tell the story of Heracles going down to the underworld to fetch the dog Cerberus. So it doesn't have to be ideological in its focus. But one of the reasons that that Christians were so attracted to the idea of the cento in late antiquity was that the cento allowed them precisely to navigate the relationship between past and present in a strongly ideological way. Why did Christians embrace the form of cento? Because of its obvious ideological force. You can take pagan material and strip out the pagan content, thus dramatizing in the very form of the poem the reduction in status of pagan subject matter. It's rather like taking the Parthenon and turning it into a Christian church, if you like. Yashelsner has insightfully compared this practice of the cento to the architectural process known as spoliation, whereby elements that were originally found on older monuments are pillaged and placed in a new assemblage, a triumphal arch or some such. So one prominent example, indeed, is the Arch of Constantine at Rome, which is refashioned from a Hadrianic monument, again, telling a story of the appropriative power of the later culture, the power to take elements from the earlier culture and rearrange them to tell a different story. Late antique Christians then wanted to express a kind of continuity with the traditions of the past, but they also wanted to show that the pagan past was now to be seen in a different way, not as a fixed tradition, but as malleable to be exploited and rebuilt at will. Now, we have only one large-scale Christian cento in Greek surviving from late antiquity, although we know for sure that there were more, and there are more, as I say, in Latin. Now, this text is the Homeric centos of Eudocia, the wife of the Emperor Theodosius II in the mid-5th century. Here, incidentally, is another reason to think very seriously about Greek poetry in the 5th century AD. We have here for the first time in antiquity, two major epic poems composed by a woman. Eudocia also wrote a poem in 3 books on Saint Cyprian, a fictional wonder worker, and a substantial portion of this survives. Eudocia is, if you will allow me the extension of antiquity to the 5th century CE, she is the most well-attested ancient female writer. Extraordinarily. So we should be talking more about Eudocia, but that's not what I'm talking about at the moment. What I want to talk about really is as I say, the ideological strategies that she uses. Now, her cento tells a series of stories from the Bible, both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, using lines and phrases taken from the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, there's a question, as there always is with cento, of how much resonance the lines carry over with their original pagan context. If you imagine a reader at this particular time is still immersed in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and there is a real question about whether you can simply uncouple them from their context and not carry over a certain amount of resonance, contextual resonance, into the new source. But in fact, actually, it's very hard to read Eudocia like that. Time and time again, the appropriation is absolute and thoroughgoing, if you like. It becomes very difficult to read them in the context of the original source. So what Eudocia seems to do is uncouple the words from their source and reuse them at will, just like, if you like, Basil's bee that flits around, lands on a flower, takes the nourishing nectar and leaves the rest. Now, intriguingly, Eudocia also includes a prologue telling of her aims. And in the prologue, she focuses primarily not on the rewriting of Homer, but on the rewriting of an otherwise unknown bishop, Patricius, or Patrick, whose glorious but incomplete labor, to quote her, she aims to perfect. It was this Patricius, we're told, who, another quotation, narrated the story of the Hebrew race rather than that of the Argive army. In other words, turned the Iliad into a Judeo-Christian story. She also name-checks another now lost predecessor, the poet Tatian, in the art of cento writing. In foregrounding her predecessors in this way, Eudocia implicitly downplays her own originality. So Eudokia's stance is characterized by what sociolinguists call politeness strategies, and it's self-consciously informed by her gender as a female poet. She says at one point, "This is a shared project between the two of us, Patricius and myself, even though I am a woman." Really fascinating lines. Co-authorship is not something that people talk about a lot in antiquity. There's always the idea of the assertive single figure, and it seems particularly significant that Eudocia, as both a female writer and a centoist, talks about a co-production of a literary text. The Cantonists' identity as a collaborative, reassembling poet using the words of others is more than just a manifestation of late antique aesthetics. It's also a gendered expression of a woman's struggle to find a voice within a genre, the epic, dominated by overweening masculinity. So the poem presents itself as an analysis, even an implicit critique, of epic's foundational desire to talk with and about men to the exclusion of women. Similarly appropriative, but different in execution, are the three Christian paraphrases that survive from the 5th century. Eudocia's own paraphrase of the story of Saint Cyprian that I mentioned above, Apollinaris's paraphrase of the Psalms, of the Hebrew Psalms, and Nonnus's paraphrase of John's Gospel. Each of these takes an original Christian text and versifies it in Homerizing hexameters. Now, what is the strategy of each of these poets? Well, that's a good question. Only Apollinaris's poem on the Hebrew Psalms carries a prologue explaining the poet's aims. And this is quite a remarkable document which deserves to be much better known. What it shows is a poet grappling with the full cultural complexity of life in the new Rome, where present collides with two pasts at once, the Greco-Roman past and the Israelite past. Apollinaris presents his paraphrase of the Psalms as a restoration of verse form to what he calls the moral teachings of glorious David, which, again quoting, were previously adorned in Hebrew meter, but during translation into the Greek language, the grace of the meter was in turn lost. So what he's saying is that the Psalms were written in a poetic form in Hebrew, but when they were translated into the Greek Bible, the Septuagint, they lost that poetic construct. Now, it's really quite unusual for Greeks to acknowledge that the Hebrew Psalms were written in a kind of poetry. And of course, the question of what kind of poetry the Psalms are written in is another kind of question altogether. But the super interesting thing here is that Apollinaris sees his strategy of returning the delivering these psalms in hexameter form as returning them to their original poetic state. So once again, we see a sense that form and content are quite distinct, and that sacred content can be reclothed in new forms without sacrificing its sacredness. And this seems to be a quite distinctively late antique Christian idea. There's a brilliant book by Francis Young, actually, on Christian exegesis that promotes this idea that late antique Christians thought it was the spirit of the Christian message that mattered, not the precise words of the form. But the adoption of poetic form is not just incidental in Apollinaris's program. He sees himself as engaging in a rearguard defense of Christian poetics against pagan claims of literary superiority. Because, he tells us, the Greeks did not realize that the Psalms were originally poems, they, and then this is another quotation, always thought the better of their own songs and had no admiration for ours. This is an ongoing refrain in late antiquity, that the pagans always think that they're better because they've got poems of their own, and we Christians need to develop a new poetic corpus to challenge them. So putting Hebrew scripture into Homeric hexameter is a form of competition with pagan rivals, a demonstration that Christians can write poetry of the highest level. At the same time, there's also, and this is where it becomes really interesting, tangled and complex, there's also a strong sense of rivalry with Hebrew traditions expressed by a kind of supersessionism. So not only is Apollinaris competing with the Greeks, but he's also saying that to turn the Hebrew Psalms into Greek hexameters outdoes the Hebrew original. Apollinaris argues that the Trinitarian Christianity embraced by Greek-speaking Constantinople represents the pinnacle of human achievement. When, and then this is quoting again, the gift of the one Godhead in three persons leapt from heaven after the resurrection of the Son of God, we're told, then God put the whole of other sounding foreign speech into one order of righteousness. In other words, God made the Greek language the dominant language, subsuming all other forms of foreign speech, a sort of reverse Tower of Babel, if you like, and decreed that there should be, again, a world language. Really interesting, the idea of Greek as a world language here. This language, which Pseudo-Apollinaris calls Ionian rather than Greek, we are told emphatically was also created by God of old. So it's not that Hebrew is the older language, Greek is super ancient as well. And that's part of Apollinaris' strategy here of using hexameters. He's calling on the antiquity of Homer in order to challenge the Hebrew claims to primacy. Greek then is the bridge between the old world and the new, embodying both the antiquity of Hebrew and the political dominance of the new Rome. Byzantine political supremacism merges with Christian supersessionism. That Greek is now the dominant language of empire, makes it the only possible vehicle for the perfected expression of divine logos. Now, there's much more that one could say about Christian poetry, but time is pushing on. And let me pivot now to a different topic. Let me talk about pagan poetry, which is really the central theme of my paper, or at least it's one of the central themes of my paper. Now, as I say, it's not super surprising that Christians are writing Christian poetry, even if the way in which they write it is, as I say, intriguing, complex, and very sophisticated. But it is surprising that they chose to write poems on pagan themes, given all of the excoriation of the immorality of the gods and so forth in pagan epic that we find in texts like the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions. What on earth did they think they were doing by writing large-scale poems in traditional mythic forms on immoral Greek gods? The most famous example of this, and the example on which I'm going to focus, is Nonnus's 5th century Dionysiaca, The Adventures of Dionysus from Birth to Apotheosis, in 48 books of hexameter verse. This is the longest surviving poem from antiquity, so it's not just a whim on Nonnus's part, it's something that he's devoted a serious amount of time to composing. Now, Nonnus also composed the paraphrase of John's Gospel that I mentioned earlier. So he is a Christian poet, we know that, but his major work, at least in terms of length, is the Dionysiaca. Other well-known poems in Greek from around this time include Claudian's Gigantomachy, Musaeus's Hero and Leander, the story of Leander swimming the Hellespont by day to meet with his lover Hero, and Caleuthus's abduction of Helen. So why, given the urgent desire to present Christianity as the dominant cultural force, did poets of this era write poems that apparently celebrated the old gods in the ancient style? Now, I have three explanations for this. One is an obvious one, which is cultural momentum. Since pagan Greek literature was still at the heart of the educational system, and we have to remember that the educational system involved the exegesis of poetry, and that was still the case in Christian late antiquity, that learning how to read and make sense of traditional poetry was what young elite men were brought up to do. So since pagan Greek literature was still at the heart of the educational system, there was still a great appetite for the literature of old. So that's my first explanation. My second is that pagan Greek themes could be neatly repackaged as fiction and thus morally and theologically firewalled off. Now, classical antiquity had a relatively flexible, or if you prefer, thin conceptualization of fiction. But I think that was sharpened in late antiquity as Christians increasingly began to present literature containing pagan gods and heroes as, by definition, a literature of fiction. And I think that passage from Agathias that I started off with is already pointing in this direction. The idea that when you write about pagan gods, you are deliberately, you are specifically imitating. You're not representing reality, you're representing a second order version, a fictional version of reality. Paradoxically, this could make pagan epic more acceptable. Once pagan epics were rebranded as simply as pure entertainment that you could dip into and out of, willingly indulged by consenting adults, then it loses its power to contaminate the soul. Now, how did pagan epics mark themselves? Christian authored pagan epics mark themselves out as fictional in late antique Greek literature? Well, there were two devices. The first is the affiliation to the Greek novel. The Greek novel was a relatively new genre, a product of the Roman Empire, and highly self-aware about its fictionality. Late antique Greek epic frequently aligns itself with the Greek novels to the extent that a poem like Nonnis's Dionysiaca is almost a blend of the epic and the novelistic. Musaeus's poem, the love story between Hero and Leander, has the same title form as a Greek novel and makes heavy use of Achilles Tatius's prose love story. So, as I say, the adoption of the fusion of the epic and the novelistic forms is part of the self-conscious fictionalization of the form that we see in late antiquity. And we don't get any of this novelizing in the Christian text. It's only in the pagan text that we get the adoption of the novel as an intertext. The second marker of fictionality that we get in these texts is the heavy use of the language of mimesis. Now, mimesis is a word with a long and complex history, as we all know, going all the way back to the 4th and even the 5th centuries. The dominant idea is that it marks representations or imitations of reality rather than reality itself. So a painting or a poem is not the same thing, same as the thing it describes. It's a second order representation of it. So once again, if we can recall Agathias Scholasticos describing the poems in his collection as, in terms of the, to quote, the clever imitation of ancient writing, and the word imitation there is mimema. Similarly, Nonnis's pagan Dionysiaca fully embraces the language of mimesis and has a very rich vocabulary for imitation, using words like tupos, nothos, illegitimate, and heavy use of the Odyssean phrase polutropos, twisty-turny. So the Dionysiaca fully embraces the language of mimesis, of imitation, to mark its fictionality, in strong contrast with the same poet's Christian paraphrase of John's Gospel, which presents itself as non-mimetic and as a true revelation. When the word mimesis appears in the paraphrase of John's Gospel, it's always in a negative sense of something that is a false depiction of the true message. So rebranding pagan epic as, in quotes, fictional was an effective strategy for neutralizing the negative associations of pagan epic. But it doesn't perhaps offer any active, positive reasons for writing pagan epic. So why, again, were people actively trying to write pagan epic? I've already given one answer in this direction, which is cultural momentum. But as I say, I think that's a relatively weak answer. To get to the full answer, we'll have to look at the material in a little more detail. Now, when you look at the three surviving pagan epics of the 5th and 6th centuries, which is Nonnis's poem on Dionysus, Musaeus's Hero and Leander, and Caleuthus's abduction of Helen, the thing that strikes one insistently is just how morally subversive this material is, as well as resolutely pagan. It systematically ticks all of the boxes for Christian disapproval, focusing insistently on sex outside marriage, pederasty, and sexual violence. The two shorter poems of Musaeus and Caleuthus are about human beings behaving in an improper way. Hero and Leander tells a story of two young people who meet at a festival of Aphrodite, the novelistic topos. They fall in love, even though she is a priestess and vowed to virginity, and subject to her parents' wishes. But nevertheless, they go behind the parents' back, and as I say, each night Leander swims the Hellespont to spend the night with her. Before one night, the candle in her tower goes out, and he drowns, at which point she throws herself from the top of the tower. Now, intriguingly, you might think that that could be a prompt for thinking about that as a kind of punishment. If you have sex outside marriage, then you're destined for an early death. But that's not the way that Musaeus plays it. He plays it very much straight, as though this were a tragic waste of two beautiful young people. Calythus, meanwhile, tells the story of the abduction of Helen by Paris, the paradigmatic tale of adultery. Calythus answers the long-standing question as to whether she went voluntarily or not by giving, intriguingly, two versions, one in real time, in which she goes willingly, and second, in a dream, to Hermione, in which she claims to have been abducted. Both these poems seemingly fly directly in the face of a famous law enacted by the Emperor Constantine in AD 324 and gathered into the Theodosian Code, which was created in the time of Nonnus in the mid-5th century. And what this tells us is that elopement is really, 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 really bad. It's the worst thing that you can do, because what you have with elopement, if you have sexual violence, then you have one person who is going against the dominant social order. But when two lovers elope together, you have two people who are conspiring to go against the parents' wishes and the and the social order. Intriguingly, the law also goes on to say that people who corrupt young girls with stories, with fabules in the Codex Theodosianus, and depraved exhortations, pravis suasionibus, about amorous elopements, they're faced with a grim punishment. They will have molten lead poured into their throats. So in other words, the law is not just telling us that eloping is really, 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 really bad. It's also telling us that stories about elopement are really, really bad. So both Musaeus and Calythus seem to flout this law. So both these poems seem to be, as I say, deliberately countercultural. And then we have Nonnus's Dionysiaca, a massive and massively complex poem of over 120,000 words. It's highly encomiastic towards its divine subject, particularly in view of his successful conquest of India. Dionysus is the god who brought hope and joy to humanity, we're told, a great benefactor. But the content is highly problematic from a Christian point of view. Dionysus is for Nonnus primarily a god of alcohol. In book 16, he falls for a virginal nymph, Nicaea, and uses drink to overpower her. In the last book, book 48, the theme is reprised with another virginal nymph, Aura, whom he impregnates in her sleep. Nonnus explicitly links these two episodes, and that's the closing episode of the poem as a whole, pretty much, the violence committed towards Aura. Nonnus explicitly links the two episodes by having Nicaea visit Aura and commiserate with her. Now, Aura is unappeased, and when her twins, the offspring of Dionysus, are born, she cannibalizes one of them. She eats one of them. The other is snatched away before he meets the same fate and becomes Iacchus, the third Dionysus, who presides in Eleusis. So what we have here is a really strong sign that Dionysus is terrible towards women. And as I say, this is the closing episode in the novel as a whole, with the reminder of the earlier instance of Nicaea from book 16 as well, compounding the sense that Dionysus is the worst figure that you could imagine in terms of sexual practice towards women. Now, the mistreatment and abandonment of women is, of course, a common epic trope, but Dionysus's behavior is particularly shocking. And this is emphasized by a chain of abused women from books 47 to 8. We have Ariadne, who is turned to stone by the Gorgon's head, Palini, who's wrestled into submission by Dionysus, and Aura herself, who is drugged and bound. The epic as a whole has numerous other episodes that would no doubt have troubled Christian readers. So a pederastic relationship with the young satyr, long descriptions of flamboyant dancing, the Bacchant Calcomede who flirts with the lustful Indian Moreus, the story of Tectophos, who's imprisoned without food but kept alive by his daughter who visits him and breastfeeds him, and so on. It couldn't be more calculated to shock Christian readers. Now, how do we explain this apparent embrace of the most morally and theologically subversive material one could possibly imagine? Now, of course, it might be the case that the whole point is to present a pagan god as bad and to present pagan myth as full of sexual impropriety. But that's not how the poems read. They're not larded with moral condemnation, although the Dionysiaca, as I say, does have the female condemnations of Dionysus's behavior. They seem rather to revel in this moral ambiguity. So my conclusion is that pagan poetry flourished in this era, not despite, but because of the sexually repressive culture that surrounded it. Pagan poetry gave an outlet for all of the dark desires and extravagant fantasies of an elite male reading class. At the same time, the status of poetry was revised, with Homer and Hesiod replaced on the cultural pedestal with the Bible. Hexameter verse was no longer culturally central and could be imagined as pure form. Sacred texts could be versified without any great change to their meaning. It was just a matter of reclothing them, of giving them the garb of epic. Pagan myth, meanwhile, was rebranded as fiction, which paradoxically gave it a new life, as the only safe space within early Byzantine culture, where issues like lust, pederasty, sexual violence, and illicit adolescent passion could be worked through with freedom. This was a literature of the distant past, the clever imitation of ancient writing, in Agathias' phrase, but that was a crucial factor. Now, in Victorian times, the Athenian society circulated translations of risque classical texts, including Lucian, Procopius, and the Greek novelists, in small print runs to subscribers, allowing gentleman readers an outlet for their enthusiastic passions while protecting them from social stigma and guilt with a pretense of high-minded antiquarian curiosity. Much of the pagan epic of the early Byzantine period, I argue, was also of this kind. This, of course, isn't all it was. It's highly sophisticated poetry, and there's an awful lot more going on in it than I've had time to explore. These are fascinating texts in their own right, which repay reading and rereading. But this sexual prurience, if you like, I think, was a significant part of the role of this final generation of ancient epic poets. Thank you.